The 20th of October, 1943. Warsaw, Poland. 17. Ludwicki Street, 2nd floor. A package fell from the window at 4:15 inches the afternoon. The woman below, Janina Grabowska, caught it without breaking stride, and tucked it under her arm, as she continued walking toward Marszałkowska Street. Inside the package were narrow strips of paper, each no wider than a finger, rolled tightly and wrapped in cloth. The strips contained names written in code, 2 names per line, separated by an equals sign. Marysia Kowalska equals Rashila Rosenberg, Stanisław Nowak equals Dawid Goldstein. 2,500 pairs in total. 9 Nazi soldiers were climbing the stairs. Their boots struck each step in rhythm. By the time they reached the 2nd floor landing, the package was already 2 blocks away, moving through the crowded streets of occupied Warsaw, where one more woman carrying one more parcel drew no attention from anyone. The door to apartment 17 opened before they knocked. Inside stood Irena Sendler, 4 feet 11 inches tall, wearing a simple dress with no insignia or identification. Her hands were empty. The soldiers entered and began their search. They checked 3 rooms, bedroom, kitchen, sitting area. They found clothing folded in a wardrobe, dishes stacked beside a sink, 1 wooden chair, a table, 2 cups. No files, no lists, no records of any kind. The apartment had been searched twice in the past week. Each time, the soldiers found nothing. This time would be no different. One soldier, younger than the others, asked in German where she kept her work documents. Irena replied in Polish that she kept no documents at home. He repeated the question. She repeated the answer. The exchange lasted less than 30 seconds. At 4:30 p.m., the ranking officer placed her under arrest. The charge was listed as conspiracy with the Polish underground resistance. The penalty for such conspiracy, under German occupation law established in October 1941, was execution by firing squad. No trial was required. No appeal was permitted. They had been told she worked for an organization that helped Jews. They had been told she maintained records. They had been told she knew names and locations. All of this was true. What they did not know, what no interrogation would reveal, what no search would uncover, was that she was the only person in Warsaw who knew where those records were buried, and she had just thrown them out a window. The Gestapo had spent 6 weeks tracking her. A woman who ran a laundrette on Bracka Street had been arrested in early October. Under interrogation, she revealed names of resistance operatives who used her shop as a message drop. Irena Sendler's name was among them. The Gestapo knew she worked for the Department of Social Welfare. They knew she had access to the ghetto. They knew her code name was Jolanta. They did not know that in 18 months, using ambulances, toolboxes, and coffins, she had smuggled 2,500 Jewish children out of the Warsaw Ghetto and placed them in hiding with Polish families, orphanages, and convents across the city. They walked her down the stairs at 4:47 p.m. Janina Grabowska was already at 9 Lekarska Street, handing the package to another woman, who would bury it under an apple tree in the back garden within the hour. The soldiers loaded Irena into a vehicle. The engine started. The street was quiet. By nightfall, her name would be entered into the intake log at Pawiak Prison, where the average time between arrival and execution was measured in weeks, not months. The jars containing the names would remain buried until the war ended. The children would survive. The names would survive. Irena Sendler said nothing during the drive. February 1917. Pawiak, Poland, 15 miles southeast of Warsaw. Dr. Stanisław Krzyżanowski died of typhus on a Tuesday morning. He had contracted the disease from patients. His colleagues refused to treat mostly Jews from the poorest sections of town who could not afford medical care. He treated them anyway, charging nothing, visiting their homes when they were too weak to travel to his office. The infection took hold in late January. By mid-February, he was dead. His daughter, Irena, was 7 years old. After the funeral, leaders from the Jewish community offered to pay for the child's education. Irena's mother, Janina Krzyżanowska, declined the assistance, but the offer was remembered. Irena grew up knowing that her father had been the kind of physician who did not distinguish between patients based on their ability to pay or the religion listed on their identity papers. 23 years later, the distinction became law. The 15th of November 1940, Warsaw, Poland. The Germans sealed the Warsaw Ghetto. The wall stood 3 meters tall and ran for 18 kilometers through the center of the city, cutting streets in half and separating neighborhoods that had existed side by side for centuries. Barbed wire was strung along the top. Guards were posted at every gate. 400,000 Jews were ordered to relocate into an area measuring 3.4 square kilometers. The population density became 5 to 10 times higher than any city in the world. By April 1941, the number had grown to 460,000, as refugees from surrounding towns were forced inside. The Germans feared typhus. The disease spreads through body lice, which thrive in overcrowded conditions where sanitation fails and clean water becomes scarce. The Warsaw Ghetto, by design, provided ideal conditions for an epidemic. German occupation authorities issued a directive in early 1940, one stating that epidemic control workers would be granted permits to enter the ghetto for sanitary inspections. The permits were intended to monitor the spread of disease and prevent it from reaching the German personnel and the Polish population outside the walls. Irena Sendler applied for one of these permits. She worked as a senior administrator in the Warsaw Social Welfare Department, a position she had held since 1935. On her application, she listed her experience with public health protocols and her familiarity with infectious disease prevention. She did not mention her father. The permit was approved in early 1941. The permit allowed her to enter the ghetto daily, sometimes multiple times per day, under the pretext of conducting sanitary inspections and distributing typhus vaccines. She wore a white armband with a blue Star of David as a gesture of solidarity with the Jewish population. She carried a medical bag. Inside the bag, beneath bandages and vaccine vials, she smuggled food, money, and forged identity documents. The 4th of December, 1942. Warsaw, Poland. The Council for Aid to Jews, codenamed Jagoda, was officially established as an agency of the Polish government in exile. The organization operated in secret, coordinating efforts to provide false documents, housing, and financial assistance to Jews in hiding. The council was divided into 8 departments: legal, finance, residential, anti-blackmail, propaganda, children, medical, and clothing. In January 1943, Jagoda provided aid to 300 people. By December of that year, the number had grown to 2,000. By mid-1944, it reached 4,000. August 1943, Warsaw, Poland. Irena Sendler was appointed head of Jagoda's department for the care of Jewish children. Her code name was Jolanta. She had been working with the underground since 1939, forging documents and arranging safe houses. But this appointment formalized her role and expanded her network. She recruited at least one person from each of the 10 district offices of the Social Welfare Department. Together, they issued hundreds of false birth certificates, baptism records, and identity cards. Irena personally signed at least 400 of these documents. The law was clear. Under German occupation policy, enacted in October 1941, any Polish citizen who provided aid to Jews, whether shelter, food, or forged papers, was subject to immediate execution. The penalty applied not only to the individual, but to their entire family. The risk was documented. The work continued. By the time of her arrest, in October 1943, the system was operating at full capacity. The names were recorded, the children were hidden. The permit that allowed her into the ghetto had been issued because the Germans feared typhus. Her father had died of typhus. The disease had killed him. The fear of it saved 2,500 lives. January 1942. Warsaw Ghetto, Chista Street checkpoint. The ambulance stopped at the gate at 10:45 the morning. 2 German guards approached from opposite sides. The driver handed over his transit papers, stamped and signed by the Epidemic Control Department, authorizing the transport of a tuberculosis patient to a quarantine facility on the Aryan side. One guard walked to the rear of the vehicle and opened the doors. Inside, under a pile of soiled rags and medical waste, a child lay motionless. She had been instructed to hold her breath when the doors opened. Not to cough, not to move, not to make any sound. The guard looked at the rags. The stench of disinfectant and decay was immediate. The driver called out from the front, "Tuberculosis transport. Quarantine protocol, Section 412. The guard stepped back and waved the ambulance through without touching anything inside. The checkpoint crossing lasted 42 seconds. This method had been tested in December 1941 and refined through repeated use. The Germans were terrified of contagious disease. Inspections of medical transports were cursory at best. The fear that had sealed the ghetto in the first place, the fear that typhus and tuberculosis would spread to German personnel, became the mechanism for smuggling children out. By the end of 1942, the ambulance route had been used more than 80 times. 20 teams rotated through the operation to avoid pattern recognition by the guards. Each team consisted of a driver with legitimate medical credentials, a nurse, and a coordinator who selected the children and arranged the timing. The coordinator's code name was Jolanta. Her real name was Irena Sendler. She was 32 years old and had been operating inside the ghetto since early 1941. Other methods were employed when the ambulance was unavailable or when multiple children needed to be moved at once. Infants were hidden in toolboxes, their mouths wrapped in cloth to muffle any crying. Older children were smuggled through the sewers beneath Okapawa Street, crawling through tunnels barely wide enough for an adult to crouch. Some escaped through the courthouse that stood on the border between the ghetto and the Aryan side, entering through one door on the Jewish side and exiting through another door that opened onto Lesno Street. A Catholic church adjacent to the wall provided another route. Children entered through a sealed doorway in the ghetto, passed through the church interior, and emerged on the other side with new Christian names and forged baptism certificates. There were failures. In early 1942, a roundup on the Aryan side netted dozens of homeless children, many of them Jewish. Irena and her network scrambled to place them in orphanages and private homes. 32 could not be placed. The alternatives were limited: leave them on the streets where they would be arrested and executed, or smuggle them back into the ghetto. Irena chose the ghetto, knowing what awaited them there. The decision devastated her. She made a vow afterward, recorded in a letter to one of her colleagues. Never again would she return a single child to the ghetto. Every child who came out would stay out, regardless of the risk. For each child, successfully smuggled, Irena followed the same procedure. She wrote 2 names on a narrow strip of tissue paper, the child's original Jewish name and the new Polish Christian name assigned for their false identity. The format was simple: real name equals false name. The strips were rolled tightly, placed inside glass jars, and sealed. The jars were buried under an apple tree in the back garden at 9 Lekarska Street, the home of a neighbor who knew nothing about the contents. No one else was told the location. If Irena was arrested or killed, the information would be lost. Between 1942 and 1943, 2,500 names were recorded. The team that worked with her, 20 to 25 women, mostly social workers and nurses, knew fragments of the operation, but never the whole system. Each operative handled one piece: forging a document, arranging a foster family, delivering a child to a convent. Only Irena held the complete record. The last jar was buried in September 1943. The ground was soft from recent rain. The tree above stood silent, its branches heavy with late-season fruit. No marker was placed. No map was drawn. 6 weeks later, the Gestapo came for her. The jars remained where they had been buried. The names waited in the dark. Warsaw Ghetto, November 1940 to July 1942. Population analysis. The Warsaw Ghetto population peaked in April 1941 at 460,000 residents, confined to 3.4 square kilometers. The density measured 5 to 10 times higher than the world's most crowded city at that time. The wall that enclosed the area stood 3 meters tall and extended 18 kilometers through the center of Warsaw, topped with barbed wire and guarded at 22 checkpoints. Between January and March 1,941. An additional 66,000 refugees from surrounding towns were forced into the ghetto, increasing overcrowding in a space already operating beyond sustainable capacity. Daily food rations were set by German occupation authorities at 200 to 300 calories per person. The minimum caloric intake required to sustain basic human function is approximately 2,000 calories per day. The deficit was deliberate. An official German order dated the 19th of April 1941 stated that the basic provisioning of the Jewish residential district must be less than the minimum necessary for preserving life, regardless of the consequences. Between October 1940 and July 1942, 92,000 ghetto residents died before the mass deportations began. This represented approximately 20% of the total population. Causes of death were recorded as starvation, typhus, tuberculosis, and complications from malnutrition-related diseases. The typhus epidemic alone accounted for an estimated 16,000 to 30,000 deaths during this period. The outbreak reached its peak in October 1941, when infection rates increased exponentially. By July 1942, community-led hygiene interventions had reduced typhus transmission to zero, a rare documented case of epidemic elimination under siege conditions. On the 22nd of July 1942, the Gross Action Warsaw deportation operation commenced. Trains departed daily from the Umschlagplatz transfer point to Treblinka extermination camp, located 80 kilometers northeast of Warsaw. Between July 22 and the 21st of September 1942, 254,000 residents were transported. The majority were killed in gas chambers within hours of arrival. The October 1942 census recorded 35,639 registered residents remaining in the ghetto. An estimated 30,000 additional residents lived in hiding, unregistered and unaccounted for in official German records. Children under the age of 14 numbered approximately 85,000 in April 1941. By October 1942, fewer than 3,000 remained. The reduction was the result of starvation, disease, and deportation. Of the children who survived, 2,500 were smuggled out by Irena Sendler's network between 1,942 and 1,943 and placed in foster homes, orphanages, and religious institutions outside the ghetto walls. Gestapo provided financial assistance to aid recipients at a rate of 200 to 300 zloty per adult per month and 100 to 150 zloty per child. The estimated cost to save a single Jewish life through the provision of false documents, housing arrangements, and monthly stipends ranged from 6,000 to 15,000 zloty. In January 1943, Gestapo supported 300 individuals. By December 1943, the number had increased to 2,000. By mid-1944, approximately 4,000 people were receiving aid. Funding constraints prevented further expansion, despite growing demand. Irena Sendler personally issued at least 400 forged identity documents. Gestapo's total output across all operations was estimated at 50,000 documents, including birth certificates, baptism records, work permits, and ration cards. The production and distribution of these documents occurred under penalty of death, as established by German occupation law in October 1941. The numbers were documented, the results were measured, the record was preserved. The 20th of October, 1943. Pawiak Prison, Warsaw. Cell assignment, unknown. Irena Sendler was transported to Pawiak Prison at 24/26 Zielna Street, within 2 hours of her arrest. The facility had been constructed in the 1832 as a Tsarist detention center and was converted by the Gestapo into a political prison in 1939. It held resistance members, intelligentsia, and individuals suspected of underground activity. The average time between intake and execution was 3 to 6 weeks. Records indicate that fewer than 10% of prisoners left the facility alive. Interrogation sessions were conducted in the basement. Standard Gestapo procedure included repeated beatings, stress positions maintained for hours, and targeted bone fractures designed to extract information without causing immediate death. Irena's legs were broken during these sessions. Her feet were crushed. The injuries resulted in permanent disability. She provided no names, no addresses, no operational details. The interrogators knew she worked for an underground organization that aided Jews. They knew she had access to the ghetto. They did not know she possessed the only complete record of 2,500 children's identities and locations. The list remained buried under the apple tree at 9 Lekarska Street. A death sentence was issued in late October 1943. Execution was scheduled for early February 1944. Jagoda operatives, working through intermediaries, negotiated with a Gestapo officer assigned to Pawiak. A bribe was arranged. The amount was not recorded in surviving documents. On the day scheduled for her execution, Irena Sendler's name appeared on the public bulletin board posted outside the prison, listed among those executed that morning. She was not dead. She was moved out of the facility under a false transport order and provided with forged identity papers under the name Klara Dombrowska. The escape occurred in February 1944. She returned to underground operations within the same month, continuing to coordinate rescue activities while under constant risk of rearrest. German authorities maintained surveillance on known associates and former addresses, but the new identity held. Between February 1944 and January 1945, when Soviet forces liberated Warsaw, she worked under this alias without interruption. After the war ended, the jars were retrieved from beneath the apple tree. The names were intact. Surviving family members were contacted when possible. The majority of the children's parents had been killed at Treblinka or other extermination camps. The children remained with their foster families or in the institutions where they had been placed. Irena Sendler lived in Warsaw after 1945. Communist authorities in Poland persecuted former resistance members throughout the late 1942 and 1950s. Many were interrogated, imprisoned, or executed. Irena remained silent about her wartime activities for decades. On the 19th of October 1965, Yad Vashem in Jerusalem recognized her as righteous among the nations. In 1991, she was made an honorary citizen of Israel. Poland awarded her the Order of the White Eagle, the nation's highest civilian honor, on the 10th of November 2003. She was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize in 2007. She died in Warsaw on the 12th of May 2008, at the age of 98. The records were preserved. The testimony was documented. The names were remembered. September 1999, Uniontown, Kansas, Rural High School. 4 students, Megan Stewart, Elizabeth Cambers, Sabrina Coons, and Jessica Shelton, searched for a National History Day project topic. Their teacher, Norman Connard, provided a clipping from U.S. News and World Report published in 1994. The article, titled Other Schindlers, contained one paragraph about a Polish social worker named Irena Sendler, who had saved 2,500 Jewish children during World War II. The students assumed the number was a typographical error. They believed it should read 250. Research confirmed the original figure. No error existed. At the time, one website on the internet mentioned Irena Sendler. The students wrote a performance titled Life in a Jar. In 2001, they traveled to Warsaw. Irena Sendler was alive, 91 years old, living in poverty with her daughter-in-law. By 2008, more than 750,000 websites referenced her story. On the 12th of May 2008, Irena Sendler died in Warsaw. She was 98 years old. The jars were preserved in archives. The names were documented. The record remained.